This is the second video for Chapter 32 for Biology 1020. So in this first slide, what we're going to do is take a look at the components of gastric juices and do a short summary of the stomach itself before moving to the rest of the components of the digestive system. So gastric juices include pepsin, other enzymes, mainly lipases, but these are present in only very small amounts, hydrochloric acid, mucus, salts, and water. The function of the hydrochloric acid is to actually take apart the three-dimensional structure of proteins and make it easier for pepsin to break it down into smaller pieces. The point of the mucus is to provide a protein layer to the stomach lining that helps protect the stomach lining itself from the hydrochloric acid and from pepsin. If you look at the diagram on the left, there are a number of things that I want to point out about this. First of all, there are two sphincters leading into and out of the stomach, the lower esophageal sphincter and the pyloric sphincter. When the stomach has food contents in it, these sphincters will close and allow the really acidic environment to not spill out into the surrounding organs. As you can also see, there are three muscle layers in the wall of the stomach. In most of the GI tract, there are only two muscle layers, so the stomach is an exception here. And you'll notice that the fibers of the muscle layers run in three different directions. This allows for random movement of the contents of the stomach back and forth. Also note the folds in the lining of the stomach. Again, these are called rugae, and they allow for expansion of the stomach as food comes in. Moving to the middle diagram, you see sort of a zoom in on the lining of the stomach. And so again, I want to emphasize three muscle layers in the stomach where there are normally just two in the rest of the GI tract. Moving to the diagram on the far right, you see a diagram of what's called a gastric pit. And so these are basically indentations in the stomach lining containing different types of cells that produce components of gastric juices. There are three main types of cells: chief cells, which secrete a pepsin precursor, parietal cells, which secrete hydrochloric acid, and mucus cells, which secrete mucus. So the chief cells secrete this pepsin precursor. Because it's a precursor, it doesn't act on the cells that are actually in the gastric pits. Pepsin gets activated by a low pH, by a very acidic environment. So the hydrochloric acid in the stomach not only serves to help break down the 3D structure of protein, but also activates the pepsin that will break them down further. Mucus is a mixture of the protein mucin and water. So if the stomach lining has a layer of mucus over it, then what the mucus will do is to shield the stomach lining cells from both the hydrochloric acid and pepsin. You also see mucus production in the small and in the large intestines to keep protein digesting enzymes from acting on the lining of the small and the large intestine. So basically there's mucus produced throughout the entire GI tract. As the food becomes liquefied in the stomach when mixed with gastric juices, it's called chyme. And so after a certain amount of chemical and mechanical digestion, the chyme gets pushed through the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine. The small intestine has two major functions. First, it continues the chemical breakdown of food molecules into their smallest components. And secondly, it's where the main site of food absorption is. So we'll talk about absorption first. Keep in mind that the chyme is in constant motion through the small intestine. And so absorption has to occur from liquid that's basically moving past these cells. One strategy for absorbing the most nutrients possible might be to continue to lengthen the small intestine, but there are limits. The average length of the small intestine in adults is about 23 feet, and I think you can see that lengthening that any further could be problematic. So the next thing to turn to in terms of increases in surface area for absorption is folding. And you can see in this diagram that there are a number of ways in which surface area gets increased by folding. Looking at the small diagram on the top left, you can see that there are folds in the lining of the small intestine. The technical term for these folds is called the plicae circularis, which is something that you don't have to remember. They are visible, and if we get back into lab and have a rat dissection, one of the things that I'll encourage is that you cut some of the internal organs apart and can see things like rugae in the stomach and these folds in the small intestine. So these folds in the small intestine are actually visible to the naked eye. The folds themselves have got small finger-like projections of the tissue called villi. Villi themselves are very small structures. As you can see from the third diagram over, when you zoom in on an individual villus, you are actually able to see the individual epithelial cells. So these villi are very small, and it's actually their small size that allows for more surface area. This isn't all of the folding, though, that happens. If you'll take a look at the diagram on the far right, you'll see what are called microvilli on epithelial cells. And these microvilli are actually folds in the cell membrane itself of these epithelial cells. So basically you've got three levels of folding. You have large-scale folding that's present in the lining of the small intestine. You've got smaller scale folding called villi that sit on top of these folds, and each of the individual cells themselves has folds in its cell membrane called microvilli. And all of these things are to increase surface area for nutrient absorption. And again, what this does is to make the overall length of the small intestine as short as possible. Given that humans have an average of 23 feet in their small intestines, you can see that you need quite a bit of surface area to absorb even the amount of food that we do. So we're going to take a look at the first portion of the small intestine called the duodenum. So the small intestine can be divided into three sections: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The duodenum is about the first 25 centimeters of the small intestine. This translates into about the first 10 inches. Now this is where most digestion occurs, but I don't want you to get the idea that this is where all digestion occurs. Okay, this is where fat digestion begins. And so, given the two major functions of the small intestine are digestion and absorption, you see most of the digestion occur in the duodenum, but the rest of the length of the small intestine is definitely needed for absorption once the digestion actually occurs. Once again, we see villi and microvilli. I covered this at length in a previous slide, so we're just going to move on. The next thing to consider is where the digestive enzymes that carry out the chemical digestion actually come from. So some cells of the small intestine produce enzymes that are called carbohydrases, and these are going to be enzymes that digest carbohydrates. The main point of production of digestive enzymes, however, is the pancreas, which is located just behind the stomach. So what the pancreas is going to do is to produce and release digestive enzymes that will digest carbohydrates, that will digest proteins, that will digest lipids, and will also digest nucleic acids. This is not all that the pancreas releases. The pancreas also releases bicarbonate ions into the small intestine. And what bicarbonate does is to neutralize the stomach acid that's coming into the small intestine. So bear in mind that when chyme comes out of the stomach, it's extremely acidic and has the potential to cause chemical burns called ulcers to the small intestine. So the solution here is to neutralize the pH with bicarbonate. The gallbladder, which is behind the liver, will store and release bile that is produced by the liver. So we'll take a little bit more of a detailed look in bile in just a moment. One thing that I want to make clear is that the gallbladder is a storage site for bile. It's not a site of production of bile. That's what the liver does. So again, here's the function of the pancreas, which is to release enzymes digesting proteins, fats, and nucleic acids, also to release bicarbonate, which neutralizes stomach acid. The liver is responsible for, among other functions, producing bile, and what bile does is to help fats mix with water. That's not the only thing that bile does, however. What bile does is to carry out mechanical digestion, in which larger fat droplets are broken down into smaller fat droplets. You may have noticed when oil is in water that the oil droplets tend to collect into one larger droplet. So bile keeps this from happening, and this process is called emulsification. And so basically emulsification does two things. It allows fat to mix with water, but it also breaks it up into much smaller droplets, and lipid digesting enzymes can act on these a lot more efficiently than on larger droplets of fat. Moving on in the digestive system, we see food moving from the small intestine to the large intestine. So one thing I want you to see here is look at the labels that are on the left side of the picture. You'll see a sphincter, and this sphincter is called the ileocecal valve. It's the transition, it's the valve that allows chyme to move from the small intestine to the large intestine. Also notice there is a cecum there, but because we're not herbivores, the cecum is really reduced. It's really just a small pouch, and it also ends in the appendix. Once chyme makes it into the large intestine, it's the main role of the large intestine to absorb water from this chyme and also salts. One general principle that you can kind of keep in mind, it's not entirely scientifically accurate, but one sort of general principle you can keep in mind is that water tends to follow salt. So if you've ever had a mouthful of potato chips, you may have noticed that your mouth dried out awfully quickly, and it's because water does tend to follow solutes or salts. And so what the large intestine is going to actually do is to absorb salts, and then the water actually follows that. Now, no digestive system is going to be 100% efficient in terms of breaking down and absorbing all food. And so remaining undigested food gets eliminated as feces. And so what's happening here is that not all of the digestible portions of what you eat get digested, but there are also indigestible portions of food that you eat. Dietary fiber is the main component that is pretty much indigestible. And so dietary fiber is basically cellulose, which is a structural sugar that plants use in their cell walls. This is something that most digestive systems have a very hard time breaking down, and our digestive system really doesn't even bother with it. It just passes it on through. Now this slide is a summary of digestion of major organic molecules. I want you to take a look at the top row. We've got 4 major classes of biomolecules: carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and nucleic acids. What we're going to do here is to take a look at the location of digestion of these different biomolecules. So let's follow carbohydrates, the first column all the way down. Chemical digestion of carbohydrates begins in the mouth when starches are broken down into smaller polysaccharides. Now, these smaller polysaccharides are still chains of sugars. And so when these carbohydrates reach the small intestine, note that there's no digestion of carbohydrates in the stomach. When they reach the small intestine, they get broken down into smaller sugars called disaccharides, which themselves are then split in half into monosaccharides. And if you look at the very bottom of the column here, it shows an example as glucose. Glucose is a small enough molecule to be transported into the cells lining the small intestine. And it's the end product of most polysaccharides. So basically, if you go to McDonald's and have a large order of fries, the starch that's in the fries, you're eating almost the equivalent weight in glucose. So when you look at an order of fries, you can look at basically a cup of sugar. Now that you're completely alarmed by the idea of French fries, let's move on to proteins. So there's no protein digestion that occurs in the mouth. Protein digestion begins in the stomach, where proteins are broken down into smaller chains called polypeptides. Bear in mind that proteins are chains of amino acids. So these chains get unfolded and broken down into smaller polypeptides. There are still a pretty decent number of amino acids in each of these small polypeptides. So when the chyme moves on down into the small intestine, you see breakdown of these small polypeptides into short chains of amino acids, and then break down into the individual amino acids. And as you can see at the very bottom of the column, the amino acids themselves are the end point of chemical digestion of proteins, and it's individual amino acids that are absorbed by the cells in your small intestine. Looking at the third column, which is fats, you'll see up at the top a type of fat called a triglyceride. This is our main dietary fat, and triglycerides are actually a molecule called glycerol, which has 3 other molecules called fatty acids connected to it. So there's no fat digestion in the mouth, there's no fat digestion in the stomach. Well, actually there are trace amounts of fat digestion in the stomach, but not very much at all. The main location for fat digestion is actually in the small intestine. And so in the small intestine you see bile introduced to the small intestine from the liver, and what this is going to do is to emulsify the fat droplets. So again, it's going to break larger fat droplets into smaller ones and allow them to mix with water. Once these fat droplets have been broken into smaller droplets, this is when enzymes called lipases, produced by the pancreas, can act on the triglycerides, and as you can see at the bottom, they break them down into fatty acids, individual fatty acids, and glycerol molecules. Our last biomolecule is nucleic acids. So there's going to be DNA and RNA present in any type of food that we take in. There's no digestion of nucleic acids in either the mouth or the stomach. However, there's digestion of nucleic acids into individual units called nucleotides in the small intestine. These get further broken down into nitrogenous bases, pictured there in blue, sugars, pictured in green, and phosphates, which are the yellow dots. So you have a complete breakdown of nucleic acids into much smaller components. So now that we've seen the process of digestion, it's time to talk about what you need to take in order to survive. So there are 2 basic classes of nutrients: macronutrients, which are required in large amounts, and micronutrients, which are required in much smaller amounts. And so an example of a macronutrient might be carbohydrates, which are required in large amounts for calories, or proteins, which are needed in large amounts for a lot of different processes. Micronutrients might be something like magnesium or iron or copper, which are required in much smaller amounts. So this table shows minerals that are present in the human diet. And the first thing that I want to point out is that these minerals are actually elements. These are definitely things that cannot be broken down by the digestive system. So when you take these things in your diet, there's no digestive process that occurs on them. They're simply absorbed in the small intestine. I don't want to read through this entire table. What I would like you to do is to download your PowerPoint, or to look at your PowerPoint and take a look at the different functions of these different minerals and their deficiencies. So there are some things that I'll point out here. First of all, there are bulk minerals and trace minerals. This is only a partial list of trace minerals. So the bulk minerals are needed in larger amounts than the trace minerals. That being said, you don't need bulk minerals in nearly the volume that you would need something like proteins or carbohydrates. So even with the bulk minerals, the amounts that you need are relatively small. So just looking at some of these, calcium is present in large amounts in your bones, so you're going to need that for bone and tooth structure, but it's also a very important component in muscle contraction and in nervous system function. Taking a look at this might be a surprise, sulfur, which you're going to find in meat, fish, eggs, and poultry. And if you've ever smelled anyone cooking deviled eggs, you can sure smell the sulfur in that. Sulfur is part of two amino acids called methionine and cysteine, and you find these amino acids present in a protein called collagen, which we've already seen this semester. So collagen is a really important protein in hair and skin and nail structure. So without this, you get brittle hair and nails. You can also get stunted growth without this. In terms of the trace minerals, I think the one I'd like to look at here is iron. So with iron, this is part of hemoglobin and myoglobin, and hemoglobin and myoglobin are oxygen binding proteins. Oxygen binding molecules that carry oxygen through the bloodstream in the case of hemoglobin, and in the case of myoglobin, store oxygen in skeletal muscles for when you run into an oxygen deficiency. So you have to have enough iron in your diet. If you don't, you can't produce enough hemoglobin, and you basically run into a shortage of both hemoglobin and red blood cells. The other one here that I think is pretty interesting is iodine, and iodine is part of a thyroid hormone. So if you have a shortage of iodine, you'll have what's called hypothyroidism, or an underactive thyroid. And so one of the reasons why you actually see salt be iodized is because iodine deficiencies used to be fairly widespread in the United States. But when iodine was added to salt, people started getting enough iodine in their diets. So this is a chart of water-soluble vitamins. And the first thing that I want to say about vitamins is they're not elements the way that minerals are. These are molecules that are produced by other organisms. So despite the fact that we have to take these in the diet, they're not naturally occurring elements. They are molecules that are made by other organisms. And again, I'm not going to go through the entire PowerPoint. I would encourage you, again, to take a look at the PowerPoint that you have online for this. One thing that I'm going to mention here that I think is pretty neat is vitamin C. And so there are a lot of sources of vitamin C in a naturally occurring diet. So it's a little uncommon to actually have a shortage of vitamin C unless you're just not taking any kind of fruits or vegetables at all. So the deficiency of vitamin C is called scurvy, and you can see that there's weakness, gum bleeding, weight loss, but something else that actually occurs is that people lose their teeth with scurvy. This became a lot more prevalent when people began long sea voyages. And so the problem with long sea voyages is it's very difficult to store fruits and vegetables without having them mold or mildew. So a common diet on a lot of sea voyages, especially in navies, was a type of biscuit called hardtack and salt pork. So although this provided enough calories and proteins for people to get by on, what it didn't provide was any vitamin C at all. So people on extended voyages could run into scurvy. This actually caused a pretty common slur that's applied to British people. You may have heard of British people referred to as limeys. And this comes from the British Navy's use of limes. And so limes being a very good source of vitamin C, they'd be carried on British ships on long voyages, and sailors were actually, when the limes started to mildew, they'd take the limes and they would rub them into their gums to try to prevent tooth loss. And so the extensive use of limes in the British Navy resulted in the British being called limeys. So sometimes prejudice can take funny forms. These are the fat-soluble vitamins in the human diet, vitamins A, D, E, and K. And so if somebody has problems with lipid absorption, they're also going to have problems with absorption of these vitamins. So each one of these has got some pretty crucial functions. Without vitamin A, you can get blindness as a symptom of deficiency. Without sufficient vitamin D, you can have skeletal deformation. Now the reason why is because vitamin D is actually crucial for calcium absorption in the small intestine. Without sufficient vitamin D, the small intestine does a really poor job of absorbing calcium. So even if you had a lot of calcium in your diet, if you didn't have sufficient vitamin D, you're not going to be able to make use of the calcium that you've eaten. Vitamin K is actually used by the liver to construct different clotting proteins. And so the reason why a deficiency symptom is internal bleeding is you may have heard of a disease called hemophilia, which is mainly a genetic disease in which clotting proteins don't function like they should. Now, if you have a deficiency of vitamin K, you're going to have a deficiency in some of these clotting proteins, which means that your blood won't clot as much as it should, and you can get basically nutritional hemophilia and internal bleeding as a result. The best way to get all of these nutrients is a varied diet, and so what you want to do is eat as wide a variety of foods as you can manage. But eating food is not just about macro and micronutrients. It's also about getting just the correct number of calories. In other words, enough energy in your diet. So calories are a measure of the energy content of foods. And in order to maintain a particular weight, you've got to eat as many calories as you expend. So there's a lot of truth to the idea that weight is basically calories in, calories out. Now, some foods are harder to break down than others. And so if you have trouble breaking down a particular food, if you have to expend energy to break down that food, then your net gain of energy from that food is going to be pretty small, and the food itself will be low calorie. Think about something like celery, which is very low calorie because you don't get a lot of calories from celery in the first place, but it's also quite difficult to break down. In the meantime, something like the Haagen-Dazs that's pictured here is very easy to break down and contains a lot of sugars that don't require a lot of digestion. And so that means that this is going to be a very high calorie food. So overeating and undereating, this disrupts nutrient homeostasis, and both of the pictures here are actually from undereating, and I'll explain the reason why the child on the left is pot-bellied even though even though he or she has been undereating for some time. So the picture on the right is of someone who is either anorexic or bulimic. And so these are usually individuals who have something that's called body dysmorphia, in which the image that they see in the mirror is not necessarily reflective of what other people would see. So someone with anorexia who would look rather thin to you or me might look in a mirror and think that they're really fat, and so they reduce their caloric intake by that much more. So in these individuals who want to take in as few calories as possible, they either take in a very small amount of what they eat, or they eat large quantities of food but take laxatives or vomit it back up, so that their overall caloric intake, despite the fact that they've eaten a lot, is actually small. So the picture on the left is a child that is at very close to endpoint starvation, and here's the reason why that child looks pot-bellied. That's not fat, that's fluid that has accumulated in that child's abdominal cavity. So what happens here is there are proteins in the bloodstream that are responsible for reabsorbing water from capillaries. We've talked about how capillaries can be leaky, and that's where a lot of swelling can come from. It's proteins in the bloodstream that help reabsorb water and get water back into the bloodstream. And in later stages of starvation, these blood proteins are actually broken down by the body as a protein source, because the individual isn't getting protein from anywhere else. So the body will start to consume its own blood proteins. With a shortage of those blood proteins, fluid that leaks out from capillaries doesn't get reabsorbed to nearly the same amount, and you start to see edema or swelling from fluid, especially in the abdominal cavity, and that is what has happened to the child on the left. So as I mentioned, when the body's deprived of nutrients, it'll start in on its stored reserves. So carbohydrates, fats, proteins, that's not all. The body will actually pull calcium out of bones in order to meet a calcium deficiency, and that's where diseases like osteoporosis can come from. The flip side of caloric deficiency is obesity, and this happens when calorie intake exceeds the calories that you spend. So this mentions that poor eating and exercise habits lead to obesity. If somebody tracks their caloric intake, however, they can get away with not exercising nearly as much, or can actually lose weight through calorie restriction. I actually lost 150 pounds myself just from caloric restriction and not exercising. So if somebody has the wrong eating and exercise habits, it's mainly, in my opinion, the eating habits that lead to obesity. But there is something else to consider, and that's that genes can influence appetite and digestion and metabolic rate. So in some individuals, they can have a shortage of a hormone called leptin, and leptin is a hormone produced by adipose tissue that serves as an appetite suppressant. So if you have a shortage of leptin, you're going to feel hungry more than you should. And this definitely contributes to a tendency to become overweight, because if you're hungry all the time, you're going to want to eat all the time. And so this is what a shortage of leptin can do. There are genes that also influence digestion, and they can influence the efficiency of the digestive system. So how much of the nutrients that you take in do you actually absorb? If you absorb most of them, then you absorb most of the calories of what you eat, then it's easier to become obese than it is for someone who doesn't absorb as many of the calories from what they eat. Metabolic rate also plays a role. So people with higher running metabolisms, their cells simply have higher energy needs, and that basically means that there are more calories spent. And so this usually happens to people who have a high level of activity, their cells run at higher metabolic rates, or people who are growing. So you usually don't see a lot of obesity when people are going through their main growth streak during puberty, and the reason why is because their metabolism is running at a much higher level. If you take a look at the two mice at the bottom, I've seen this picture before. So the mouse that's on the left actually has a deficiency of leptin, and so that mouse runs at a higher appetite constantly than the mouse on the right, and that's what leads to its obesity. So what actually is a healthy weight? What's considered to be a healthy weight is usually calculated as a measure of height and weight. So the shorter that you are, the less you're supposed to weigh. And so this is something that's called the body mass index, and it's sort of a ratio of how much you weigh to how tall that you are. And so basically BMI is weight in kilograms over height in meters. This is also something that you can calculate using weight in pounds and height in inches. There's a slightly different formula for that. So a BMI of between 19 and 25 is considered healthy. That being said, there are a lot of people who don't go by BMI nearly so much as they go by body fat content, because if somebody has a large amount of muscle mass, because muscle weighs more than fat, this can actually raise their BMI, and somebody strictly by the BMI number may be considered to be overweight or obese, but may actually in fact not be overweight at all. Okay, so the last sort of sets of things that we're going to go over in this PowerPoint are eating disorders. And so binge eating disorder is the most common eating disorder in the United States. And essentially, these individuals eat large amounts of food. Unlike people with bulimia, they don't purge afterwards. So what that does is it does keep them from having immediate medical problems. People who have bulimia can often have esophageal ulcers, so chemical burns from stomach acid that eat ulcers into their esophagus. Also, stomach acid can actually erode away the enamel in teeth. So people who have bulimia can have ulcers in their esophagus and have an excessive amount of cavities because of the stomach acid acting on their teeth. So those immediate medical problems are not present in people who have binge eating disorder, but because they eat as much as they do, they're often overweight. The cause for this is unknown. There are a lot of people who claim that they have a variety of emotional issues with this. This is something that I can speak to a little bit. I used to eat about 2 meals a day, 1 or 2 meals a day, and they would be absolutely huge meals. I would binge and would fill my stomach absolutely to capacity. And so I was definitely a binge eater. And in my case, I'm not sure that I would call it emotional issues as much as it was in my case. I'm not saying this about anybody else, but pretty much a total lack of self-discipline when it came to food. So I would eat large amounts of food that were bad for me simply because I liked the taste. Now again, that's not something that happens with everybody. So this eating disorder, pica, is the intake of non-food items: ash, charcoal, cotton, soap, soil, wool, string. This usually affects young children, and it stops before adolescence. Now, all kids are going to eat things that they're not supposed to if you don't keep an eye on them. My parents still have an anecdote about me eating an entire package of uninflated balloons, of all things. I guess I like the bright colors. But if it's consistent, it's often associated with some sort of intellectual disability where a kid doesn't really have the ability to tell between what is appropriate to eat and what's not. Lack of proper parental care and neglect. These two things are kind of tied together. So basically, if you don't keep an eye on a kid, they're going to eat things that they shouldn't. And one of the consequences that can happen is that children are at a greater risk for poisoning, but they're also at a greater risk of doing physical damage to their GI tract, because some of these non-food items can cause damage to the lining of the GI tract. Here's another disorder of the digestive tract, stomach ulcers. So I mentioned the layer of mucus that protects the wall of the stomach. If there's some sort of breakdown in the mucus layer, this can cause the stomach wall to be damaged by the acid in the stomach, and this will cause basically a chemical burn called a stomach ulcer. Now, when I was a freshman in college, it was a major discovery that stomach ulcers were caused by a bacteria, Helicobacter pylori. Before that point, people thought that ulcers were just something that happened because of stress or maybe because of eating habits, and they couldn't be cured or easily prevented. And so the interesting thing about this is that, well, first of all, it's of great benefit to discover that there's a bacterial cause to this, because you can take antibiotics and clear it up. The scientist who discovered that it was due to bacteria, that most ulcers were due to bacteria, wasn't believed. And so his solution for convincing people was to actually drink a solution that contained a lot of these bacteria. And so this man, who had never had ulcers before, developed a really bad roaring case of ulcers. And so basically he felt like it was important enough to demonstrate that ulcers were caused by bacteria to give them to himself. And fortunately for him, his ulcers were able to be cleared up by antibiotics, and nowadays so can everybody else's. Ulcers can also occur in the duodenum, and this can be when the pancreas doesn't quite produce enough bicarbonate to offset the acidic pH of chyme, and so you can get duodenal ulcers as well as stomach ulcers. Diarrhea is the most common problem of small and large intestines. This is something that can be either acute or chronic. And so acute would be something that is short-term and sudden onset, and these cases usually happen because of some sort of infection of the lower GI tract. And this usually just happens in cases of food poisoning. So food poisoning can be mild, it can be life-threatening. I think I've talked to y'all about a particular case of food poisoning that I had that landed me in the ER, and it is something that could have easily killed me. Infections of the lower intestinal tract are not just due to food poisoning. They can be due to unsanitary conditions. And so before the advent of modern medicine and modern sanitation, anywhere where there were large groups of people, there were sanitation issues and a lot of cases of diseases like dysentery and cholera. One thing that you may find both interesting and horrifying is that more soldiers died in the Civil War due to dysentery and cholera than they did due to battle injuries. And so this used to be something that was a huge problem in larger human populations. Chronic diarrhea can be caused by Crohn's disease, and this is an inflammation of the intestine. So I want to revisit something that we've talked about. So I talked about how capillaries can leak fluid. In inflammation, capillaries become more leaky and more fluid gets out into the tissues that surround capillaries. There are a great number of capillaries that surround both the small and the large intestines, and this is for the absorption of nutrients and the reabsorption of water. And so if the tissues of the large intestine are inflamed, they contain more water than what is normal, and that makes it much more difficult for the large intestine to absorb more water if they've already got water present. And so a long-standing inflammation of the intestine can lead to chronic diarrhea. Constipation is sort of the opposite of diarrhea. And this is when you get dry and hard feces. And the first thing to say about this is what's the bottom bullet point, which is that laxative and enemas should be used infrequently. A better cure for constipation problems is a change in dietary habits. So increasing your fluid intake, increasing your fiber intake, and honestly, if you increase your fiber intake, you really want to increase your water intake at the same time. If you do both of these things, then you can resolve constipation as a problem. Constipation can be a side effect of some medications. Opioid medications in particular are bad for this. One cause of constipation can be ignoring the urge to defecate. So when you feel the need to go, it usually means that that feces have entered the rectum, which is the last 6 inches of the large intestine. And so if you ignore the urge to defecate, then what will happen is sort of a reverse peristalsis, where the feces actually move a little ways back up into the large intestine, and additional water gets reabsorbed for them. So if you ignore the urge to go for too long, this is something that can actually cause the feces to become dry and hard and give you constipation. This says that chronic constipation can also lead to hemorrhoids, and what's happening here is that the straining that's associated with trying to push out dry and hard feces actually can cause ballooning and rupturing of blood vessels in the anal sphincter. And so you'll see bruising and swelling and some blood clotting in there, and that's where the swelling of hemorrhoids actually comes from. Another disorder that can result from dietary issues are polyps. Polyps can arise if somebody has a really high-fat diet that increases bile secretion. So apparently bile secretion, the presence of the bile itself, can cause the small intestine to give off small growths from the epithelial lining. So a lot of the time these are benign, some of the time they're cancerous, and the only real way to tell the difference between benign and cancerous polyps are tissue samples that get taken during a colonoscopy. And so if polyps are detected during a colonoscopy, generally they're just burned off right away while somebody's got a camera in there. Increased dietary fiber can inhibit polyp development because this can promote the excretion of bile. And so basically what happens here is that dietary fiber will bind to bile, and if it binds to bile, it has much less of an effect on the lining of the large intestine. Other disorders include pancreatitis, which is an inflammation of the pancreas. This can be due to alcohol use, gallstones, it can be unknown factors. In pancreatitis, you see pancreatic enzymes damaging the organ, causing inflammation, and if it does enough damage to the organ, it can decrease the ability of the pancreas to produce insulin, which is what leads to, which is one way that leads to type 1 diabetes. It can unfortunately also lead to pancreatic cancer, which is almost always fatal, and there are a few reasons why. So the pancreas has essential functions. So the production of digestive enzymes, the production of insulin, and so it's a really crucial organ. And not only is it a crucial organ, but unfortunately it's also really fragile, and it's an organ that really can't be transplanted from one person to another. So if you have pancreatic cancer, your only real hope is that it's caught before enough damage is done. The problem with pancreatic cancer is that it's very resistant to treatment much of the time, and that in pancreatic cancer, pancreatic cancer tends to have cells that spread really quickly, that divide at a high rate. And so usually by the time that somebody notices the symptoms, pain in particular, from pancreatic cancer, it is almost always too late. So here are some disorders that involve the liver and the gallbladder. Jaundice is a high amount of a compound called bilirubin in the blood. And so bilirubin is basically a breakdown product of old red blood cells. And normally this is contained in the liver and sent to the large intestine for defecation. But if there's a large amount of it in the bloodstream, this can cause a yellowish discoloration of the skin, and in particular, a yellowish discoloration of the whites of the eyes. Hepatitis is an inflammation of the liver, and this is something that is usually caused by one of several viruses. So you may have heard already of hepatitis A, B, and C. So hepatitis C used to be, really just about a death sentence 20 or 30 years ago, and it is actually something that can be cured nowadays through antiviral agents. So it's pretty amazing how medical technology can proceed from decade to decade. Cirrhosis is a buildup of fibrous scar tissue in the liver, and the main cause of this is usually alcoholism. And so the scar tissue is a product of the damage that the alcohol causes. Now, one thing that can be said is that cirrhosis can be limited and in some cases reversed a little bit if somebody stops alcohol use at a certain point. The liver does have a limited capacity for regeneration, and so sometimes cirrhosis can be either halted or reversed before it hits a lethal level. The last thing mentioned here is gallstones, and this is when crystallized cholesterol blocks one of the major bile ducts that empties into the small intestine. And so this backup of the bile duct causes backup of bile into the liver, and that causes damage to the liver, which causes the release of bilirubin into the bloodstream. And so jaundice, a slightly yellowish, again, coloration of the skin and the eyes, this can result from gallstones, and if somebody has chronic gallstone issues, a lot of the time this is going to require removal of the gallbladder. This is a picture of different gallstones, and so you can see this is layers of crystallized cholesterol. And as far as scale goes, each one of these numbers represents centimeters, and so each 2.5 centimeters is 1 inch. That gives you an idea of scale, but the tubes or the ducts going from the gallbladder and going from the liver into the gallbladder and going into the small intestine, these are really small ducts, and so they can be they can actually be blocked by gallstones pretty easily, and this is something that's also extraordinarily painful. The last thing that we're going to do is to take a look at how a modern diet has affected tooth decay. So you've probably all been told that eating a lot of candy causes tooth decay. It's because oral bacteria, which are normal to have, they release acids to try to keep other pathogenic bacteria and to keep fungi from invading the mouth. But the problem is, if you have an overpopulation of these bacteria, then they can produce enough acid to damage the enamel on teeth, and you get cavities from this. So one thing to mention is that a modern diet has a lot more sugar in it than more ancient diets. The Industrial Revolution allowed large-scale production of refined sugars, and so for about the past 150 years, there's been a lot more sugar in our diets. So how do you compare bacterial communities in the mouth with ancient bacterial communities? With that, you scrape tartar from the teeth of skeletons from different times. Medieval, more ancient than that, Bronze Age, more ancient than that, Neolithic, and then really ancient Mesolithic. And then also plaque and tartar were collected from living people in Australia. So even though the bacteria aren't still alive in the tartar of the ancient skeletons, DNA from the bacteria still is present, so you can take a look at this for levels of DNA. The two species of bacteria that the scientists were interested in were Streptococcus mutans, which causes cavities, and Porphyromonas gingivalis, which causes gum disease, or you've probably heard of gingivitis. That's what causes periodontal disease. Well, their analysis actually revealed that the bacterium that causes gingivitis has remained pretty steady even since ancient times, but the other bacterium which causes tooth decay has become a lot more common with the availability of sugar. And one question is, why haven't we adjusted to this, and why hasn't natural selection caused changes in the ecosystem of the mouth? Why do we not fight off larger populations of bacteria that cause tooth decay? The reason why is because 150 years is a blink of an eye in evolutionary time. And so basically there hasn't been time for the human species to adjust to the larger amount of sugar in the diet. And so this is not only reflected by higher incidences of cavities, but it's also reflected in higher rates of diabetes and higher rates of heart disease.